My name is Joni Anderson. As part of this team, I will be serving as your moderator today. All across the state, there has been a huge cry for nonpartisan fair maps over and over again. We have done it in many different ways, from county resolutions to referendums, to rallies, to phone calls, letters to the editors, visits to their offices, and educational programs such as this, to help determine and show the need to have a change in how our voting lines are drawn. People no longer want it done behind closed doors. They want it done in transparent and nonpartisan fashion. So onward and forward. At this point in time, former Wisconsin Senators Dale Schultz, co-chair of the Fair Elections Project, which helped organize the Gill and Whitford litigation, and have talked about gerrymandering and its harm to the political process in Wisconsin. They say they are politicians from different parties and that they disagree a lot, but they also agree. They agree that they love our home state of Wisconsin, but are deeply concerned about the political system in Wisconsin being broken. So appearing virtual, Dale Schultz.
Let me just begin by saying a great big thank you to everybody who's online and in the room there. It seems like it was just yesterday, but it was actually quite a few years ago that Tim and I embarked on this journey together to do something about a problem that we saw that was harming our democracy and causing a great deal of consternation amongst our friends and neighbors. And I'm talking about gerrymandering. It was one of the last bills we worked on together in the Wisconsin legislature. And we were greatly dismayed when Leader Fitzgerald at that time refused to honor the request of two former leaders to at least put the bill before the legislature so that the public could see on Wisconsin Eye or in person a debate about a very important subject. Little did we know at that time that the deterioration of public discourse would not only continue unabated, but would actually accelerate. These days, I'm sure all of us are familiar with situations where we attend church, go to a service club, or just meet friends somewhere to be very, very careful about what we say about politics because people immediately erupt. And that's sad because I think that when we are working together, there's almost nothing that we can't resolve and by way of doing that, improve the lot of all Wisconsinites. And it's taken me a long time to realize that the people who disagree with me are good people, and their perspective is just very, very different than mine. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that we all seem these days to live in silos and echo chambers. I think the greatest thing about everybody who's here today is we've, I think, collectively sort of come to that conclusion and realize the best way to get through to folks on the other side is to be disciplined, patient, and conciliatory, and doing everything we can in order to explain how we feel in a way that doesn't turn people off. And I think that's starting to make a difference. And I think we've also stepped forward with our plan, a plan to improve government for everyone. It's really dismaying to me that a Republican Party that I participated in for over 50 years has seen fit not to even recognize there is a problem and to step forward with some sort of a plan themselves. But through our collective efforts, we have seen the process go to the United States Supreme Court. We've seen members of the legislature introduce bills, and now we find ourselves sort of at a position where we're sort of waiting for the Wisconsin Supreme Court to make some decisions about the governor's committee, and then we'll have to see what the federal courts do. I believe that we have done everything possible. I can't think of anything more that we can do other than to stay engaged and recognize that every one of us has the collective responsibility to combine our voices and to continue to speak to our friends and neighbors, and indeed the courts, to make certain that we don't lose our precious democracy. Let me just talk a little bit about this experience for me. I won't kid you that leaving the legislature was with mixed emotions. I enjoyed what I did for over 50 years, but I also had gotten to the point where the fun wasn't necessarily there because nobody really wanted to work to solve problems. And one of the great things about getting to know many of you and those who are listening online is that that optimism, that inspirational flame that I've always looked for in public discourse has been rekindled. Each and every one of you is important, more important than you know. When we first started, Tim and I, we had to explain, the historical origins of gerrymandering, and had to explain to people how it cheated folks of their rightful power as a citizen. And it's been very gratifying to see, as we would talk, more and more people would pick up the banner and carry it a little bit further forward. And that means that whether we are talking to our friends or neighbors or indeed our relatives, progress was made bit by bit. And again, I just think it's outstanding that so many of you have stayed with us to the end and committed today on a beautiful sunny day when you could be out bird watching or hiking to sit and be a part of a project that is critically important to the future of our state.
So at this point, we have questions. Most people in Wisconsin support ending gerrymandering. However, once many legislators get into office, the opinion of the party overtakes the opinion of the people. How do citizens get legislators to express the will of the people?
I think the answer is that we have to advance our arguments and make certain that it is crystal clear where the public is at. When we first started this, the common refrain was, oh, this is just inside baseball. The public doesn't care. Both political parties do this, and it's what politicians do to each other. And it's really not that important. Well, I think as time has gone by and we've discussed this intelligently and thoughtfully with our friends and neighbors, we've been winning the day. I'm not sure, maybe somebody who's on or our host can explain how many counties now have passed referendums and resolutions, and where we sit with other communities around the state. But it's impressive, and each one of those efforts has taken multiple people being fully engaged in order to win the argument and get the outcome that we sought. Each and every county that I went to, of those that I was involved with, it started out with a great deal of skepticism, but as people stepped up and talked about this issue and why it was important, suddenly people realized that they had more in common with each other in the room than they did with distant political parties that seemed not to care about their circumstances in their counties. And it's been very gratifying to see that, because I think that by even just doing that step, the county boards that I'm thinking of in my area began to work together in ways that they haven't in a long time. This morning, I was delighted when I got up to hear that our county board had gotten together with the Counties Association and was advancing the idea that it was time to do something about increasing shared revenue, because we have starved local government to the point where it can no longer carry out its functions. I see that as a direct result of a process that began when people with very different ideas came together to realize they had to work together to get things done. And I think it's just a very, very positive development that's going to continue to provide fruit for all of us. And we just need to stick with it and have the stamina that it takes. Every great social change in our lifetime has been the product of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people digging in and speaking with one voice about what they wanted. And we see that happening again all around us. And I'm actually fairly optimistic because it's clear that people know that they need to be united and to make it clear to politicians that they cannot hide, that we are not going away, that we care very much, and that we believe in fair play and a debate that yields the best thoughts among all of us to solve our problems.
Okay, well, I have another question here that had been submitted. So given that partisan politics go back further than gerrymandering, and it seems to be even more bitterly intense these days, is it prudent to assume that lasting real change can be effected?
Yes, I think it is. And let me just give you a little personal anecdote. I left the legislature and I was asked by a filmmaker to do a film about Wisconsin and the polarization that we had. And at the end of that film, they showed me with my wife sitting on the front porch of our front porch at the farm. And I was kind of sad, I guess, about how little that I had been able to affect what I saw was wrong. And I didn't completely understand what it was that was hampering me. Well, since that time, I've gained a much greater understanding about analytics, about polling, about the smart people who take a look at metadata to figure out how they can motivate people. And I've learned that these folks have understood that making people angry was the best way to motivate them. And of course, what have we seen? We've seen our computers filled up with messages, whether it's Facebook or some other app or whatever, with messages that speak to the worst of people, that agitate our worst fears, our prejudices. And we all have some prejudices, and they don't respond to the better angels of our nature, but the worst. And when that happens to everyone, we have sort of what we have right now. People get suspicious. They don't talk to each other in church or at the service club or the grocery store. And everybody walks around with their arms folded in front of their chest, just trying to keep their distance and their heart somewhat protected from the slings and arrows that seem to come from every direction. We are beginning to understand this more and more. And if you look at the public, they understand it, I think, better than ever. And I think it's what fuels a lot of the anger and frustration about organizations like Facebook and other people who have been given an opportunity to draw us together and have, in fact, pushed us apart for profit. And, whether or not Congress will step up on a bipartisan basis and respond is not known. But I think there is a chance that will happen, and that will be a very big step forward. In my opinion, that's one of the greatest things continuing to divide us. That and talk radio and television news, which isn't news at all. Any way you look at it, though, each of those mediums has a negative message, and it's why we have to be different. And we can't name call people, but we have to wait for folks to sort of come to the realization it's time for a change, and that what we're offering is the best that's in our society and a real opportunity to solve our problems. Hating your neighbor never wins anything.
Okay, Next, we'll have Pat Schmidt. She's monitoring some of the questions from the chat.
Hi, Dale. Thank you for coming today. Can you comment on how gerrymandering negatively impacts the function of school boards and town government?
Well, what gerrymandering ultimately does is it devalues the votes of individual citizens, and it's done by putting them in situations where the outcomes of elections are known because of the use of computer power and analytics. The way that winds up then ultimately hurting local government is their ability to talk to their constituents about their needs are correspondingly diminished along with the citizens. And I think as these governments begin to realize that, they know that they have to get a better shake. And the better shake is a system that will allow their voice to be heard equally in the public square. It doesn't matter what motivates you, whether it's local government concerns, shared revenue, or whether it's abortion or gun control, whatever environmental policy, university policy, whatever issue is visceral to you is diminished when each of us has our voice silenced or diminished.
Okay, and I have one more. Just yesterday, a Wisconsin state legislator made a statement that Republicans have to cheat in the election because Democrats cheat. How does one deal with such baseless accusations?
I think we have to calmly, call those folks out and say, well, what exactly do you mean by democratic cheating? What evidence do you have of it? And give them an opportunity to express themselves. And if what they come up with is, well, I saw it on Fox News, or I heard it, or read it on Breitbart or something, I think we have to be prepared to firmly say, look, that's not proof, that's somebody's opinion. Demonstrably, let me tell you why I feel like Republicans are rigging the system. And then you have an opportunity to talk about voter suppression, about gerrymandering, about the ways that citizens have found themselves having a harder and harder time to participate in the democratic process. I don't think we have to win over everybody every time we have a discourse, but I think the fact that we operate in a way where we deal from a calm, fact driven basis, other people will see that and will tend to listen to us more.
So Steve wanted to ask about the lease change for the maps, and what you think about that.
Well, what I know about it and think about it is that there is a difference of opinion about what lease change represents, and that's the issue that the courts are going to have to decipher. When that is done, then there will be an opportunity, for aggrieved parties who believe that whatever comes out of that either complies or doesn't comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a legal background, so it's really difficult for me to opine about what the Supreme Court might be thinking and what legal issues there are. But my understanding is it has to do with this notion about what lease change means. That's what they said they're going to consider, but it appears that how you view lease change and factor in some other things like equal number of people in every district, or how close you get to that, are matters that are going to be considered by the court.
Now we're coming to the part of our program discussing what's next. While planning this day, we thought it wouldn't be complete without a discussion about this. While it's in the courts, who better to lead a discussion than an individual with the law firm itself, Law Forward. Law Forward is a nonpartisan, nonprofit law firm committed to protecting and advancing democracy and to restoring Wisconsin's progressive tradition. Law Forward works on several different fronts. They do litigation from legislative overreach, challenging administrative action or inaction, as well as public education on issues that protect the democratic principles revolving around Wisconsin's traditional commitment to clean and open government, always with the goal of moving forward. So here we are, Mel Barnes, Law Forward.
Thanks, Joni. Thanks, everyone, for having me today. I'm Mel. I'm staff counsel at Law Forward, and we've been involved in the redistricting litigation in Wisconsin really from the get-go. In the state Supreme Court case, we're representing the League of Women Voters, and I see Debra is here today, along with Black leaders organizing communities and Voces de la Frontera and some individual voters across the state. So we have been involved in the litigation. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, what the court's lease change order means, and kind of what we can expect next, what options might remain after that. So originally, we expected a challenge to redistricting to be heard by a federal court. That's how it's been every time there's been divided government in Wisconsin in the past 60 years. We filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of those plaintiffs and some other groups in August. But a conservative group in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, or WILL, asked the state Supreme Court to step in and hear this case. This is a request that the state Supreme Court has had before. They've always turned it down. Judges on the state Supreme Court are elected instead of appointed for life. They're not quite as insulated from politics as the federal court. So it's really unusual that they agreed to hear this case. And not just for that reason, but because they don't have as much experience with the types of legal issues that are involved in redistricting. So it's unusual that the state Supreme Court agreed to hear this. They didn't really have a process set out for how they would hear the case, take evidence, decide on new maps. So a lot of things about this litigation have been a bit unusual along the way, because the court is really figuring it out as they go. So on November 30th, the state Supreme Court decided that they were going to consider all new proposed maps under a framework called a least change approach. It means that they wanted everyone proposing maps to take the existing 2010 gerrymandered maps as a starting point and make as few changes as possible to bring it into compliance with law and population shifts from the 2020 census. This is something that we argued very strongly against when the court was considering how it would decide this case. We think starting with the 2010 maps is a political decision that really is inappropriate for the court to make. What our state constitution requires is that the districts be apportioned anew every 10 years, which really says, okay, we start from scratch. We divide this up based on where people live. And it doesn't mean that we change everything, but it means that we're not tethered to the past maps. Knowing that the 2010 maps were this extreme partisan gerrymander, we knew that would be even more consequential than usual, and we argued against it strongly. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that this was the approach that they were going to use, and we've all been proceeding under that framework, starting with the 2010 maps, making changes to bring the districts into compliance. It means that we had to really throw out the fair maps that we had drawn before this order and start from scratch. But we knew that the court wasn't going to change its mind about this, so we did what we had to do. On December 15th, the state Supreme Court let all of the parties to this case And there are 9. That's a lot for a lawsuit. Normally there are 2 parties. There are 9 in this case. The court let all the parties have a chance to submit proposed maps. And really that is what everyone did. Everyone said, here are our new maps for the state assembly, the state legislature, or sorry, the state senate. Some folks did the congressional seats too. Here's our proposal based on the old maps for what new maps should look like. This is how we think you should balance population shifts from the 2020 census, how we think you should make sure that you're still complying with the Voting Rights Act and other laws relevant to redistricting. And everyone then also sent in, of course, big 50-page briefs arguing why their maps were the best. So there were 7 different submissions for the state legislative maps, 7 different ideas. Notably, Will, who convinced the court to take up this issue to begin with, did not submit proposed maps. They said, we're just gonna wait and see what other people submit. We think that, we'll just tell you which ones are best. Again, a very unusual position to take. They did not submit maps at all despite starting this. So we submitted maps on that date, Law Forward, along with our co-counsel at the Campaign Legal Center in Stafford Rosenbaum, on behalf of our plaintiffs, submitted maps for the state assembly and the state senate. And what we did is we followed the court's order, making the least changes possible, but we made those changes in a very mindful way. We said, okay, we have to shift some population to account for the fact that really the Madison area has grown in population in a couple areas in the state. When we're making those shifts, how can we make the maps better? How can we put communities of interest back together? How can we put counties back together? How can we make sure that these maps are as beneficial and as fair as possible, given the constraints that we're under? And we were able to do some really meaningful improvements, in my opinion. We were able to put Sheboygan back into one assembly district, Beloit back into one assembly district because of those shifts in population. And when we looked at the Milwaukee area and the census figures from 2020, we realized that the Voting Rights Act really was not being complied with in Milwaukee if we kept the same 6 Black majority districts from the 2010 maps. We realized that because of population shifts, basically the Black voting age population had grown, the white voting age population had shrunk in Milwaukee, that under the Voting Rights Act, Black voters were entitled to 7 districts instead of 6. And that means that we had to make some meaningful changes to the lines in the Milwaukee area. But we explained to the court why this is required. Even though it's least changes, you still have to comply with federal law. So these 2 pieces, the Voting Rights Act and how and where you comply with the least change approach, were really the focus of the briefing and of the oral arguments that the court heard this past Wednesday. So on Wednesday, we were all at the Supreme Court. All the lawyers were there for just over 6 hours, arguing for their maps, critiquing other maps, and engaging with questions from the justices. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we might think, where things are headed, what the justices are thinking based on the questions they asked and the arguments that the parties made. But I do really just want to start by pointing out so much of the arguments focused on the Voting Rights Act and specifically how the Black community in Milwaukee is structured in these maps and what seats they're entitled to under federal law. And it was lost on no one that this discussion that was so focused on Black voters in Milwaukee was playing out in a courtroom full of white lawyers, arguing to a bench full of white justices, while we were really talking about the future of Black communities in our state. And it was a really egregious lack of representation, including from Law Forward, and that's not okay. This is a huge piece of our democracy that we really need to focus on improving going forward, including in our progressive communities, maybe especially in our progressive organizations. We need to make sure that when we are making these decisions that really are going to impact our state for the next 10 years, that they're open to everyone's participation. We need a more diverse set of lawyers, a more diverse bench on the Supreme Court, because we can't continue to make decisions about other communities for them. And I just want to highlight that that is really key in areas like voting rights and redistricting when this is such a focus of the discussion. So the Voting Rights Act is really the heart of this case. That is what Law Forward has thought from the beginning, because that is the area where some of the biggest changes in our state are required based on the 2020 census. And the Voting Rights Act in Wisconsin really applies to the Milwaukee area. That's where we have communities of color that are protected by the Voting Rights Act in numbers high enough to really trigger this federal legislation's protection. So we argued to the court that the state legislative maps must include 7 majority Black opportunity districts that perform. That means that allows voters in those districts to elect candidates of their choice without their votes being diluted by white voters. And 7 Black majority districts are required, period. We think that the court cannot draw maps that comply with the Voting Rights Act without creating these districts, even though it does involve departing from the 6 district configuration that's currently drawn in Milwaukee. Even under a least change approach, this is necessary. We engaged some of the top voting rights experts in the country to really talk about racially polarized voting in Milwaukee and to show the court why the act is triggered here. There was a lot of debate, particularly because the state legislature in their proposed maps, which they passed as SB 621 through the legislature, they were vetoed by the governor then, but they brought those same maps to the court. They only draw 5 districts that would allow Black voters to elect candidates of their choice in Milwaukee. So that's a step backwards from the current 6. Again, not least change and not doing it for a reason of compliance with federal law. That's something that we push back on very hard. And I think something that Justice Hagedorn, who is really the swing vote on the court, was skeptical of. He asked a lot of questions about the Voting Rights Act and about the legislature's maps and whether or not they would comply. There are some other proposals before the court that we think come close to complying with the Voting Rights Act. The governor's proposal, which is not the same maps that were adopted by the People's Maps Commission. When the least change order came out, the governor's lawyers threw out those plans because they were not based on the old maps and came up with a new proposal. We think those maps come close to complying with the Voting Rights Act, but we think that there is one district where it would be difficult for Black voters to overcome vote dilution by white voters in things like Democratic primaries. So we offered our critiques to the court on that. That said, the governor's proposal, Senator Bewley's proposal, several really were much better than the legislature's proposal in this way when it comes to compliance with the Voting Rights Act. The other way that the legislature's maps really came up short are under this least change analysis. So I think we had a question before about what does this even mean? What is least change? How do you measure that? And that, of course, has been a topic of debate among the parties, but it's somewhere where we've really seen the legislature's partisan motives, I think, come out in full force. At the beginning of this litigation, the legislature says, yes, we want least change because we want to keep the current gerrymandered maps. And then when everyone put in maps and they were able to see that the governor, Block, the Senator Bewley's maps were all able to basically match their metrics on least change, they started changing their tune. And they said, actually, we think you need to look at getting population deviation down to 0, getting everything as close as possible, all these other things, to the point where Justice Hagedorn, who again is the swing vote, at one point during oral arguments said, I'm a little concerned. I don't want us to be loosey with the football here. We told the parties that we wanted them to do least change. We wanted maps that performed well in this metric. And now it sounds like you want us to change our mind and measure these maps by something else. And I think that's exactly what the legislature is arguing. On one hand, you can't fault them for wanting to win. On the other hand, they got what they asked for from the court, which is a least change approach. And then they really failed to abide by it because they wanted to draw these districts in a way where they have even more of a partisan advantage. There are several areas across the state, including example in the Fox Valley area, where in the legislature's maps, you see them swapping big groups, thousands of voters back and forth across districts. Now, there's no explanation for that under the least change approach. You move the lines as little as necessary. You would never be swapping back and forth big groups of population like that. Of course, the legislature, was looking at how these districts would perform. And I think they decided to do that so that they could have additional solid Republican seats, but that's not what the court asked them to do. So we'll see really how much the court decides to stick to this least change approach that they've set out. And we're hoping that Justice Hagedorn will really be the swing vote on sticking to that. So I'm just going to turn really quickly to what comes next and then open up for some questions. We now wait for the state Supreme Court to rule. We can expect them to pick a set of maps and say, these are the maps for the next decade in Wisconsin. And we hope that they'll do that as soon as the end of this month. We just had oral arguments on Wednesday, but we are really in a short time frame here to get everything ready to go for 2022 elections. So we hope they'll rule quickly. If the state Supreme Court chooses maps that don't comply with federal law, and here that likely means the Voting Rights Act, which is a federal statute, we'll have the opportunity to challenge those maps in federal court. The federal court won't take the state Supreme Court's maps on appeal. That's not how it works. The state Supreme Court gets the final word on state law. But if there is a lack of compliance with federal law, we could bring that challenge in federal court, and the court there might redraw the Milwaukee districts to bring them into compliance with the Voting Rights Act. They likely won't touch the rest of the state. So once we see what the state Supreme Court picks, we know that those will be meaningfully the maps for most of the state for the next decade. But we do know that there is at least some opportunity to go to federal court if there's a lack of compliance with the Voting Rights Act, and we would be prepared to do that. We know that maps need to be finalized and in place by basically March 1st for the Elections Commission to start noticing and administering the election in these new districts. So again, we continue to be on a really tight timeline, but we are in the final stretches here waiting for the court to decide. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions, and thank you guys so much for joining me today.
I had heard that they had split up the community of River Falls and the university. Was that how one of the maps went?
In the legislature's map, yes, I do believe that they divide River Falls into at least 2 districts, possibly 3. And I believe that is a departure from the current maps. I don't remember that community being split in the current maps, but it could be.
Well, I just wanted to comment as an alumni of UW River Falls, the way the town is and the way the university is. You know, there's just a street in between them.
Yeah. I saw Joni's question in the chat that asked if the Supreme Court can take one party's assembly and Senate map and another party's congressional maps. Yes, that is absolutely true. The congressional maps are not tied to the state legislature maps. So for example, Law Forward, on behalf of our clients, we did not submit congressional maps. We just submitted assembly and Senate maps. Now, the Assembly and Senate maps do have to go together because, as I'm sure you all know, the Senate districts are nested assembly districts. So you take 3 assembly districts into each Senate district. So those 2 do have to go together. But I think that it is possible, and in fact, pretty likely, that the court picks state legislative maps from one party and congressional maps from another. For example, the Republican congressman from Wisconsin, led by Glenn Grothman, got together and submitted congressional maps, but just congressional maps. The governor has proposed both state legislative and congressional maps, but not all of the parties have submitted both.
Pat has a question coming from chat.
So the question was, what is the impact of Democrats moving more into urban areas? So because Democrats, particularly in Wisconsin with our geography, have really move more into urban areas, this does result in a small, and I want to emphasize that it is small, natural advantage for Republicans in redistricting in Wisconsin. Just because of that geography, Democrats do slightly self-pack. But I want to be super clear about this. That does not explain the level of partisan gerrymandering that we saw in the 2010 maps. They took that natural advantage and then they gerrymandered the heck out of it and blew it off the charts. So in Wisconsin, if we were choosing like perfectly fair maps, they would see a slight Republican advantage, maybe a couple of seats in most elections. However, they would be responsive maps. That means that in a swing election, Democrats could capture control of the state assembly, of the state Senate. Wisconsin just is not that divided. We are a really purple state, and either party should be able to win in even a small wave election. So while there is some truth to that, it has been blown really out of proportion in Wisconsin. And luckily we have all sorts of very accomplished mathematicians and ways of showing this now that I think people struggled with in 2010 to really prove whether this was natural or the product of the partisan gerrymander, and we know that it is. Thanks, Cheryl. So the question is if we can flip the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, because right now of the 7 members, 4 are very conservative, 3 are traditionally considered liberal. We can flip that balance, we'll be able to challenge the least change decision. And the answer here is somewhat yes. I think if we do have a change in the Supreme Court balance because of the 2023 election for what is currently Justice Pat Rogensack's seat, she's retiring. If we can flip the balance, I think it's possible to bring other challenges to these maps under state law. We wouldn't likely be turning back to the least change decision, but what we might be able to do is bring a claim that the Wisconsin Constitution, our state constitution, prohibits partisan gerrymandering. That's a challenge that's been successful in other states, and it's a door that is currently closed to us on the federal side because of the US Supreme Court's decision in Rucho. But if we had a different court here in Wisconsin, they would be likely more amenable to a challenge like that. And that's a way that we could develop good case law for years to come. That would then be a more permanent protection for the state of Wisconsin. Okay, the question is, do I see any path in the future to a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and would that be desirable? Yes, I think yes on both counts. It's not something that the court is going to step in and require. However, if we're able to pass the Freedom to Vote Act at the federal level and the John Lewis Act, there are some protections in there that would require nonpartisan redistricting commissions, at least for congressional maps. So I do think there's a path. I think that the most likely path is through the legislative process in the state of Wisconsin. And that is one of the reasons that it's so important that we get better maps out of the 2022 process that we're in right now. We know we're not going to fix the partisan gerrymander because of this least change order, but if we can make some meaningful progress and get slightly fairer maps to allow Wisconsinites to elect people to the Assembly and the State Senate that believe that we should have a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and we can get legislation passed in our state, we know that our current governor would sign that, and that is a path forward in Wisconsin. I do think that when it comes to nonpartisan redistricting commissions, the devil's in the details, and it's really important that we do it right. We've seen other states have really effective commissions like this, and we've seen other that have just become another institution that is subject to partisan capture. So I think we want to make sure that we do it right, but there certainly are examples of that out there.
I am really pleased to be here, and I happen to be wearing the same shirt I was wearing in the picture that was on my screensaver. I am the organizing director with the Fair Maps Coalition, and I was hired because of that event that Joni mentioned, that Amanda, who's also on this call and now works for the coalition, helped organize in Marshfield. So out of that, we have been working around the state for a little over 2 years now to get grassroots folks engaged and involved in trying to change what's going on with our state legislature. And the first step in that was to educate folks, because people had heard the term gerrymander, but they didn't really know what it meant. So now we are at the place where yesterday we had over 1,000 people in 18 rallies in various places around the state saying we want our courts to create to choose from among the maps that Mel referred to, the one that best represents the people of the state. Now, as she said, we know that none of the choices that they have are good choices, but we are putting them on notice that we're watching them and that we will hold them accountable. And one of the ways that we can hold them accountable is in the next election. The other thing that's really important, and I'm sure Debra Cronmiller, who's also on this panel, will speak about, is that the legislative maps do not impact local elections, and they also do not impact statewide elections. So it's while your vote may be diluted or packed because of the way lines are drawn for the district that you live in, for who you elect at the legislative level. It's really important to note that who you elect at the local level, your county board supervisor, your municipal, either your town supervisor or your city alderperson, or school board members, those are not impacted by these maps. And those are super, super important elections on a local level. And also statewide elections are not impacted by these. So US Senate, the governor, the attorney general, the state treasurer, and the state secretary of state are statewide elections that are not impacted by these maps. And it's really important that we educate people about that, because when they think about, well, my vote doesn't matter because the maps are rigged, they're not thinking about those local elections that really impact their lives, like, you know, whether your road is going to get plowed on a regular basis, or how your teachers and students are going to be treated, or on the statewide level, the governor's race, the US Senate race, and the others that I named. So please keep that in mind. We will be advocating about that as we move forward as the Fair Maps Coalition, because we want to make sure that people stay engaged in this civic process. And we also want to continue to keep spotlighting, highlighting, amplifying, lifting up, all the words that I can think of for making a lot of noise, educating folks about what's going on with the Supreme Court so that they understand how our Supreme Court is behaving. Because we know that they've already made a very partisan decision, as Mel alluded, or actually maybe she said right out loud, in keeping the least changes approach. So I'm very gratified that there are so many people on this Zoom, and also people in the room today who are concerned about this. And I invite you to first of all make sure that you are registered to vote in the elections this year, and that you stay engaged with us. The league will come on in just a minute with Law Forward, and you just keep yourself engaged with this group, so that you know what is coming up, or if you're on Zoom and you're from a different area, that you find a Fair Maps team that you can work with, or a League of Women Voters chapter that is doing work on this. So thank you for that. I'm looking here to see if there are any questions for me, and I don't see any, so I'm going to turn it back over to Joni. Thank you so much.
Speaker is Debra Cronmiller, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. Debra has been a member of the League for about 30 years. She has held numerous leadership positions, including serving as the president of the State Board of Directors. Debra is also the League's people-powered Fair Maps State Redistricting Champion and a member of the lead team for the Fair Maps Coalition in Wisconsin. She is here today to speak on the Fair Voting Act. Debra?
Thank you, everyone, for being present, for being engaged, and for all the work you have done to get us to today. And I will just preemptively say thank you for all the work we still have to do. Wisconsinites of every color, creed, background, zip code, we all agree we should pick our elected officials. They should not pick us. And that is what we have been fighting for as an organization for the last 10 years, since we got the gerrymandered maps out of the 2010 census. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the fight that we've been in, and how Carlene just kind of connected some of the dots for how we've amped up this work in the last couple of years under the Fair Maps Coalition's banner. But the League since 2011 have been in this fight. The original fight was the Whitford v. Gill case. That was a case that marched from the state courts to the lower federal courts, ultimately to the state, or to the federal Supreme Court, where we were ruled essentially as not having standing. We had a number of plaintiffs in our case. that represented different constituencies in Wisconsin, but really only about the 12 of our 72 counties were represented. And the Supreme Court decided that wasn't a big enough swath of the state represented to have standing in the case. So they sent us back. Go get more plaintiffs, have standing, and then we'll rule. Well, what happened between that action and the end of 2018 was a North Carolina case called the Russo case that they did weigh in on. And unfortunately, their verdict, their decision in the Russo case was that the Supreme Court had no inclination to actually rule on partisanship of a map. They could rule on the other legal categories defined in statute and constitution, but that there wasn't a test, there wasn't a good enough test in their mind for what is too partisan. So as a result, they said, you know, federal courts are not going to talk about partisan redistricting. We're not going to weigh in on it. Well, that took the air out of our Whitford balloon, as it were. We never did go back to the Supreme Court to have them weigh in because they already told us they would not. And we turned our attention and our energy as an organization from kind of state by state fights, as we had done and as Wisconsin had been doing since 2011, to a national fight called the People Powered Fair Maps fight. This initiative of the League is in lockstep with the Fair Maps Coalition. And it's critically important that there's so many of us that are crossing over between the coalition's work and the League's work in the People Powered Fair Maps initiative. We share goals, and that's what makes our work so productive, I think. One of the biggest goals is we need to put into law, federal law and state law, that gerrymandering maps on partisan grounds should be disallowed. In Wisconsin, for 7 legislative sessions now, bills have been offered that would make it illegal, essentially, would put into Wisconsin law that you cannot create partisan maps that would be not allowed. This year, the bills were AB 389, SB 395. And if these numbers are not rolling off your tongue, I'll tell you why. They didn't even get a hearing. Our elected officials are so confident that they don't need to listen to us, the people who should have put them in their chairs to begin with, that they don't even have to talk about this. Marquette's polled year after year, over 70% of all of Wisconsin's population believes we should have fair maps, not partisan maps. And yet we can't even get a public hearing on the bills that would give Wisconsin that law. We are seeing the same nasty, cantankerous discussion happening now at the national level over the Freedom to Vote Act. Another act similar to what Wisconsin's been trying to do with getting in law a prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. The Freedom to Vote Act would essentially at the national level guarantee that all states would not be subject to partisan gerrymandering. Because it is not just a problem here in Wisconsin, it is a problem in many states. Some states, like Iowa, have solved that problem through very neutral and fair redistricting commissions. Some states, like Illinois, gerrymander very Democrat, Massachusetts, very Democrat, Maryland, very Democrat. And then there are states like Wisconsin that because of the folks who were in power at the time when the map was made, they go to the Republican side. We need to stop this, and the way to stop it is with the federal legislation. Or, you know, in Wisconsin specifically, we could solve it with state legislation. But, you know, the people's will needs to be amped up. You know, we in this room today, in this call, we're all bought in. We know what we've been what we have done, what we are doing, and what we need to do to get this done. But not everyone is raising up their voice. So I think that's a big piece of work that we have yet to do, is to make sure every elected official in this state knows that we will hold them accountable. And you know what that means? We need to have those hard, difficult conversations with our friends on the other side of the political spectrum, as it were, and ask them, cross over. They're not representing you. They're not giving you, their constituent, what you want. You want fair maps. They're not giving you that. You want, Medicaid expansion. They're not giving you that. We want school funding. We're not getting that. There are so many things that we are not getting as citizens in Wisconsin because of these partisan gerrymandered maps. And then we need to hold our elected officials accountable. We need not let them stay in these protected seats. We need to do what Mel was talking about, is to make sure we get better maps this time. We get the opportunity to have our voices heard, and that we can make some meaningful change over time. I want to lift up that, sometimes we can get kind of doomy and gloomy in this space, but we need to applaud ourselves. We have done some excellent work in the last years. We have had so many of us write letters to the editor that were printed and read by all sorts of people in our communities. In the fall, we stood up an email campaign, email your legislature, tell them that you want fair maps. 4,250 emails were sent out to our elected officials as a result of that campaign. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. And that's what we are doing. We're doing this. We're doing educational forums and meetings and rallies, and that's meaningful. And of course, we just keep finding new and more partners to enter this space with us. And that is how we are going to have more impact than we are even having now. And we are having a lot of impact right now. I must tell you, I was sad to hear Mel Barnes talk about our Wisconsin court and our national Supreme Court. When we know what the ideology of our judges is, something's wrong. The judicial system is supposed to be the fair and impartial check and balance to what is the executive and legislative branches of government that we know are political. The courts are that space where politics is not supposed to be even discussed or known. That we know who the swing vote justice is, that we know before a shred of evidence is ever presented what a ruling might be, indicates to all of us that our courts are broken right now. And we need to reinstate fair courts in Wisconsin and across this nation. The Fair Maps Coalition, the League of Women Voters, we're really pivoting right now to amp up this discussion, because it's only when we have the backstop of a fair and impartial judicial system will we ultimately have a place where grievances from the political system can be heard and heard fairly. This is going to be big work, I got to tell you. But having seen what I've seen over the last 10 years, we can do this work. This work is the same type of work, frankly, as we've been engaged in the fair map space. We had to teach the people, what is gerrymandering? Why is it bad for us? What aren't we getting as a result? Now we need to talk about fair courts. What is it? How do we get it? How do we get it back? And why is it important in our democracy? I trust all of you to help with this important fight. I also trust that after we get the Supreme Court of Wisconsin's decision, we will have ample opportunity to critique that decision, to, as Mel discussed, to probably challenge that decision and to lift up on a regular and ongoing basis all of our voices that have been purposely squashed, and we need to get our power back. We need to vote. We need to compel our neighbors to do that. We need to not accept a 50% turnout. We need to be there 100%. Every voter votes. Every vote counts. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Carlene. Thanks, Jody.
Okay, next, Carlene would like to say a couple more items, and then we'll be bringing Joe up to speak.
I just wanted to point out, says, vote for politicians who will support nonpartisan redistricting. So on the Fair Maps Coalition website, we have a voter pledge to that effect, and we will be letting politicians know that. And we'll also, as we get closer to the November election, we will have, before the primary and then before the general, a candidate pledge to support nonpartisan redistricting. So even though the official redistricting won't happen for another 10 years, we do want people to be on record because we can pass that legislation at any time. And then the other thing is to just note, for those of you in the room, there's some counties in this area that have not passed a referendum yet. So that's always something that can happen on the April ballot or the November ballot. So think about those things as other ways to educate and amplify around this issue.
Okay, so next, we're going to bring up the chairman of the Midwest Fair District Maps, Joe Horvath.
Thanks, Joni. First of all, thanks everybody for being here. Just a few things about the Fair Maps, Fair District Maps Midstate, which is who we are that put this together. We're a group, we're citizens from 7 counties in this area. They talk about in national politics, the flyby countries, the flyby states, going from East Coast, West Coast, back and forth. We're kind of the drive-through counties. And that's Adams, Green Lake, Marquette, Portage, Wapaka, Waushara, and Wood counties, and kind of the Central Sands areas. So we got together, we initially started a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, our first meeting in Green Lake in the little library in Green Lake in December of 2019. And a lot of people at that time were just being aware of this problem. One of the problems that a lot of people don't know about the whole process of redistricting. I think that's changing now, as Dale Schultz alluded to the fact that when he first started, very few people understood that there was even a process every 10 years after the census. I think that's changed. I think a lot of people know now, but still a lot of people do not know how the process has been distorted through gerrymandering. I was chairman of the Waushara County Fair Maps, and we were very successful going to the county board, presenting, doing a lot of writing to the editor, speaking to various service groups, and many times when you would explain the whole idea of nonpartisan redistricting and how gerrymandering has distorted and gamed the whole process, you'd hear comments like, well, this is a no-brainer. Or one person said, well, voting against fair district maps is like voting against apple pie. It's so anti-democratic. You would hear those comments all the time. So just one of the things I want to bring up right now is just, we're just a group of common citizens trying to promote the common good. we were organized to the point where we joked about, well, my job was herding cats, but it was a very satisfying, gratifying activity, exercise. So I want to encourage everybody to get involved in this. You can get into an organization. There's some empowerment when you have others allied with you, but just talking to people, asking them how, asking them what they know about the redistricting process, giving them some information. Mike McCabe, who's the founder of Blue Jean Nation, which is kind of the model for the Waushara Commoners, a nonpartisan group of common citizens promoting the common good. A couple things really stuck in his book, Blue Jean Nation. And one was that most of us can agree on most things. 95% of us can agree on most things. But the parties get a lot of power from pushing us to the extremes, dealing with those extreme things, picking scabs. But if we can stay focused on that middle part, we can get a lot done. Another thing he brought up in the book was Cesar Chavez, who was the great agricultural worker union organizer on the West Coast in the 60s, was asked one time, how are you such a great organizer? And he said, well, I don't know about being a great organizer, but I talked to one person, and then I talked to another person, and then I talked to another person, and gradually you've talked to enough people that get the idea, that feel that your idea is worth pursuing. So that's what I would strongly encourage as we leave here. We are in it for the long game, regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court. Our group and many people here that are involved with it are in it for the long game. Some things right now, though, when you do go out and talk to people, and I think most people that have a good relationship understand this concept, you have to treat people with respect. You have to deal with them from where they're coming from. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a rich background. And if you get to know those backgrounds, you'll connect with people. So I want to encourage everybody, motivate people, get involved, whether it's with a group like ours, and you can find us, go to the Fair Maps website, you can get information, contact information, but get out there and you can start today just talking to people about this program. So anyway, thank you again for those that showed up here, those of you that showed virtually, and we'll just finish up. Joni, thank you.
So today you've had the opportunity to hear about gerrymandering from several different sources, from Dale Schultz, past state Senate and Majority Leader, from Law Forward, the firm that is representing us in court, the League of Women Voters, and the Fair Maps Coalition. These are all people who have stood with us and raised their voices along with us on how important it is to have nonpartisan fair maps. It is important that our legislators listen to us, the people, and are responsible to them, not their party or their big corporate donors. Today, we also want to stand in solidarity with all the grassroots organizations and individuals who have taken time away from their busy schedules to work on this issue. Our voting lines decide so much in this state. Funding for public schools, broadband, healthcare, just a few. Right now, there are many issues not being addressed or touched because of these voting lines, because they simply feel they don't have to. So today, the Fair District Maps Midstate Group wishes to thank you for attending this event and making it a success. We also want to thank all of our partners for making this a successful day. Thank you.